Daniel had no idea his world was about to collapse until he overheard a conversation that pierced his heart more painfully than any betrayal he could have imagined. Moments later, he stood frozen, watching his wife casually sitting on his best friend's lap, her smirk like a dagger stabbing into his chest. That night, the marriage certificate lay in shreds and the wedding ring was thrown at her feet as he walked out of the life he thought he knew. But that wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of Daniel's transformation. Before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. And if you love gripping stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Daniel and Grace's home buzzed with life as friends and family gathered to celebrate their 12 years of marriage. The living room was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and warm conversations. Grace's radiant smile seemed to light up the room as she chatted with guests, while their children played noisily upstairs with their cousins. Everything seemed perfect, like a scene pulled straight from a family movie. Grace's voice called out above the din, effortlessly commanding Daniel's attention. "Daniel, honey, can you grab the wine from the kitchen?" she said, with a smile that barely met her eyes. "Sure, give me a minute," Daniel replied, weaving his way through the guests. He glanced back at her, marveling at the life they'd built, oblivious to the unraveling truth waiting just around the corner. As Daniel uncorked the bottle of wine, the muffled sound of voices from the hallway caught his attention. His mother's voice, normally calm, was tinged with urgency. Curiosity pulled him toward the doorway, and he took a few hesitant steps closer, careful not to make a sound. "Are you crazy?" his mother whispered sharply. "Daniel's here. He could catch you too." Daniel froze, his pulse quickening. What could she possibly mean? Then, Grace's voice cut through the air like a dagger, dripping with contempt. "You're a filthy wretch. You want to try out? Catch us? What's he going to do? Cry about it?" she sneered. "He's too pathetic to stand up to anyone. Besides, he's just a walking wallet. I don't care what that loser thinks." The words hit Daniel like a freight train, each syllable slicing deeper than the last. His throat tightened as he leaned closer, the shock rooting him to the spot. How long had this been going on? And why was his own mother involved? Confusion and betrayal churned in his chest, but he knew he had to see it for himself. Heart pounding, Daniel stepped into the hallway, his breath caught in his chest. The scene before him shattered whatever disbelief lingered in his mind. Grace sat casually on Eric's lap, her fingers lazily twirling through his hair as if she didn't have a care in the world. The casual intimacy of the moment twisted the knife deeper. Grace turned her head, locking eyes with Daniel. Instead of guilt or panic, there was only defiance in her gaze. Her lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, grow up, loser." "Yeah, we're together," she said, her tone dripping with contempt. "And what are you going to do about it, huh?" Daniel's fists clenched, but before he could speak, Grace continued, her voice lowering into a venomous warning. "If you even think about divorcing me, you'll never see your kids again. Don't forget that." Eric stammered, his face pale. "Damn, man, it's not like that. We didn't mean for you to—" "Shut up," Daniel snapped, his voice cold and unwavering. For the first time, his gaze didn't falter. Something inside him broke, and something stronger began to take its place. Daniel's gaze shifted to his mother, standing a few steps away, her face etched with guilt and hesitation. The realization struck him like a blow. She knew. She had known all along. His voice broke through the tense silence, sharp and accusing. "You knew about this, didn't you?" he demanded, his tone rising with each word. "How long, Mom? How long have you been covering for them?" His mother flinched, wringing her hands as she struggled to find an answer. "Daniel, it's not like that," she said weakly, her eyes darting away from his piercing stare. "Let's just go back to the party and—" "Don't lie to me," Daniel's voice thundered, cutting her off. His anger boiled over. Years of trust and love for his mother now tainted by betrayal. Her silence only deepened the wound, leaving him no choice but to confront the truth head-on. Daniel stumbled back into the kitchen, his mind reeling. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of Grace's betrayal pressing down on him. His hands trembled as he yanked open a drawer, the sound of wood scraping against metal cutting through the suffocating silence. There, buried beneath a pile of forgotten papers, was the wedding certificate. The once prized symbol of their vows and shared dreams now felt like a cruel joke. He held it in his hands, staring at the ornate letters, his name intertwined with hers in scripted font. His chest tightened as a bitter laugh escaped his lips. "This paper represented everything I thought we had built together," he muttered under his breath, the words laced with bitterness. What a lie. Without hesitation, Daniel ripped it down the middle. The tearing sound echoed through the empty kitchen like a thunderclap, sharp and final. He didn't stop. Piece after piece, he shredded the document until it was nothing more than fragments of a broken promise scattered across the counter. His wedding ring caught his eye, glinting mockingly in the fluorescent light. The sight of it made his stomach churn. He pulled it off with shaking fingers, gripping it tightly as he turned and stormed back toward the hallway. Grace and Eric were still there, their hushed conversation abruptly halting when he appeared. Without a word, Daniel flung the ring at Grace's feet, the small metallic clink reverberating louder than any shouted argument. "Congratulations," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You two deserve each other." For a moment there was silence. Grace stared at the ring, her lips curling into a smirk. She crossed her arms and tilted her head, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Oh, what are you gonna do now? Cry about it? Run away like you always do?" Daniel didn't take the bait. He met her mocking gaze with icy calm, the kind that comes after a storm has wreaked its havoc. He didn't need to argue. The truth was clear, and nothing she said could diminish the depth of her betrayal. Turning on his heel, he walked past them without another word. The cold night air hit him as he stepped outside, slamming the door behind him. His heart pounded in his chest, anger and pain warring for dominance. He didn't know where he was going, but anywhere was better than that house, that lie of a home. Behind him, he could still hear Grace's voice, muffled but unmistakably smug. Her laughter rang out like a taunt, but he kept walking, refusing to let her words sink in. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a spark of resolve. Grace had taken so much from him already, but she wouldn't take his dignity. With each step he took away from the house, the weight on his shoulders lightened ever so slightly. He wasn't sure what came next, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't let her destroy what remained of his life. The house was quiet now, almost oppressively so. Daniel sat alone in his office, the faint glow of his phone illuminating his face. The images on the screen blurred as he scrolled, each swipe cutting deeper into his already fractured heart. Photo after photo appeared, snapshots of what he had believed were moments of happiness. Birthdays, anniversaries, family vacations. In each one, Grace's smile shone brightly, her arm casually draped over his or holding the children close. How could something so perfect have been a lie? The questions echoed in his mind, relentless and unforgiving. He stared at one picture longer than the others, his thumb hovering over the screen. It was their 10th anniversary, the two of them standing by the ocean, arms wrapped tightly around each other. His smile was genuine, full of love and pride. But now, staring at Grace's face, he saw something else. A detachment he hadn't noticed then, a distance masked by the tilt of her head and the way her lips curved into that practiced smile. He swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "How did I miss the signs?" he murmured, his voice barely audible in the stillness. "How did I let it get this far?" His mind replayed moments that now seemed glaringly obvious in hindsight. Her frequent nights out with friends, her dismissive responses whenever he expressed concern, the way she brushed off his unease with Eric's increasing presence in their lives. One memory stood out sharply, like a shard of glass piercing his thoughts. He had confronted her once, timidly, about how close she seemed with Eric. "You're paranoid," she had said with a scoff, her tone dripping with disdain. "Eric's your best friend. Stop acting so insecure." The words rang in his ears now, a mocking echo of her deception. Insecure. That was how she'd silenced him, how she'd made him question his instincts. And he had believed her. He had convinced himself that his doubts were baseless, that she was right and he was wrong. It was easier to trust her than to face the possibility of betrayal. A wave of anger surged through him, hot and consuming. His hand curled into a fist, and before he could stop himself, he slammed it down on the desk. The sharp pain radiated up his arm, grounding him for a moment. The sound reverberated through the room, breaking the suffocating silence. He leaned forward, his head resting in his hands, his breathing heavy. But as the anger ebbed, something else took its place. Resolve. He lifted his head slowly, his jaw tightening. Sitting here, wallowing in self-pity, wasn't going to change anything. Grace's betrayal had already stolen enough from him. He wouldn't let it take his future, too. He owed it to himself, and more importantly, to his children, to stand up and fight for what was left of his life. He set his phone down, his fingers steady now. The time for reflection was over. He had decisions to make, actions to take. As much as it hurt, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new, something he would rebuild, stronger than before. With a deep breath, he straightened in his chair, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little lighter. For the first time that night, a sliver of determination flickered within him, cutting through the darkness. The following morning, Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the contact information of a lawyer he had bookmarked months ago but never thought he'd need. His fingers hovered over his phone, hesitant for just a moment. Then, with a sharp exhale, he tapped the number and pressed call. The line rang twice before a confident, calm voice answered. "This is Claire Matthews. How can I help you?" Daniel introduced himself, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. He summarized the events of the night before, his words clipped but deliberate. Claire listened attentively, her professionalism a welcome anchor amidst the chaos of his thoughts. When he finished, she spoke with reassuring precision. "Adultery cases can be tricky, Daniel," she began. "But given the evidence you've already gathered, you have a strong foundation. What's most important now is protecting your children. We'll make sure Grace can't use them as leverage." Her words were a lifeline. "What do I need to do next?" Daniel asked, already bracing himself for the battle ahead. "Yes. Start documenting everything," Claire instructed. "Texts, emails, social media activity, anything that corroborates the affair. If there are receipts or financial records showing inappropriate spending, include those too. And if you have access to security footage, that can be invaluable." Daniel nodded, determination hardening his resolve. "I'll get started right away." Over the next few days, he poured himself into the task. It wasn't easy. Each piece of evidence felt like another stab to the heart, but he knew it was necessary. The first step was Grace's phone. She often left it charging on the kitchen counter, assuming Daniel was too trusting or too oblivious to snoop. But now, trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. One evening, while Grace was upstairs, Daniel seized the opportunity. Scrolling through her messages, he found a trove of damning texts between her and Eric. "Erico, I can't wait to see you tonight. He's clueless as always. Thanks, everyone. I'll keep living and going on my way. Even if he finds out, what's he going to do? He's too soft to take action." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened, his jaw clenching at their casual cruelty. He forwarded the texts to his own phone, carefully deleting the evidence of his intrusion. Next, he turned to receipts. Using their shared bank account, he traced lavish dinners and hotel stays disguised as work expenses. Each line item painted a clearer picture of their betrayal. Then came social media. While neither Grace nor Eric had been reckless enough to post incriminating photos, subtle clues emerged, matching locations tagged at suspiciously similar times, overlapping comments exchanged that now felt painfully obvious. Finally, he checked the home security system, a measure he had installed years ago for their family's safety. Reviewing the footage, he found more than he'd bargained for. Intimate exchanges between Grace and Eric on nights Daniel had been working late or out of town stared back at him from the screen. The raw footage was undeniable, a reality he couldn't ignore but could finally use to fight back. The process was grueling, each discovery reopening wounds that had barely begun to scab over. But Daniel didn't falter. His anger and pain had crystallized into a clear objective: to ensure Grace couldn't manipulate the situation to her advantage, especially when it came to their children. When he reconvened with Claire, he laid everything on the table. She scanned the evidence, her expression unwavering yet approving. "This is strong," she said firmly. "With this, we can ensure you retain custody and that Grace faces consequences for her actions." For the first time in days, Daniel felt a spark of relief. He wasn't helpless, and he wasn't alone. The pieces were falling into place, and the path forward, though steep, was now unmistakably clear. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow on a house now thick with tension. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside him as he stared blankly out the window. His mind was racing, but outwardly he was composed. He knew Grace would come downstairs soon. It wasn't in her nature to leave things unresolved for long, especially when she thought she could twist the narrative to her advantage. Sure enough, the sound of her heels clicking against the wooden floor echoed through the quiet house. Grace entered the kitchen, her expression casual, her movements deliberate. She was dressed immaculately, as if nothing had happened the night before, her confidence an infuriating reminder of her audacity. Grabbing a cup from the cabinet, she poured herself some coffee and leaned casually against the counter, watching him. "So," she began, her voice light but with an edge of irritation, "are we going to talk about your little outburst at the party? Or are you just going to keep pouting?" Daniel didn't react right away, refusing to meet her gaze. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the silence stretching uncomfortably. Finally, he placed the mug down and turned to her, his expression unreadable. "What's there to talk about?" he asked evenly, his tone calm but detached. Grace rolled her eyes dramatically and let out an exasperated sigh. "Oh, come on, Daniel. Don't be so childish. Nothing happened with Eric, and honestly, your insecurities are ridiculous. You made a fool of yourself last night over nothing." Her words, meant to dismiss and belittle him, didn't have the effect she expected. Instead of reacting with anger or defensiveness, Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her with a calmness that was unnerving. It was a look Grace wasn't used to, one that didn't scream vulnerability or desperation. "Don't worry, Grace," he said, his voice steady and deliberate. "I'm taking steps to fix that." She paused mid-sip, lowering her mug slowly. The confidence in his tone caught her off guard, but she quickly masked it with a scoff. "Oh, really? And what's that supposed to mean?" Daniel stood, his movements slow and deliberate. For a moment he said nothing, simply holding her gaze. The silence stretched long enough for discomfort to creep into her features, though she tried to hide it behind her usual facade of indifference. "It means I'm done being blind," he said finally, "and I'm done letting you walk all over me. Fixing my insecurities? That starts with holding people accountable." Her expression faltered for a split second before she recovered. "Oh, please," she said, her voice sharpening. "Don't act like you're some victim here. You've always been so exhausting, Daniel. Constantly overthinking, always so paranoid. You make everything harder than it needs to be." He smiled faintly, a reaction that unnerved her even more. "Maybe I was paranoid," he said, his voice unshaken. "But I was right, and you know it." and she stared at him, impressed and hovering on the verge of tears. He finished. Grace's confidence started to crack, the realization settling in that this wasn't the same Daniel she had grown used to manipulating. Her voice rose slightly, tinged with frustration. "Fine, Daniel. Go ahead. Keep being dramatic. It's not going to change anything." Daniel took a step closer, his calm demeanor unwavering. "You're right, Grace. It won't change anything about what you've done. But it'll change everything about what I do next." She froze, her smirk faltering for the briefest moment. She searched his face for the man she could control, the one who backed down when pushed too hard, but he wasn't there anymore. Without another word, Daniel turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing alone, her grip tightening on the mug in her hand. Her carefully constructed world was beginning to tilt, and for the first time, she wasn't sure how to regain control. Upstairs, the faint sound of their children laughing filtered down, an ironic reminder of what was truly at stake. As Daniel climbed the stairs, he felt a strange sense of clarity wash over him. The confrontation had only solidified what he already knew. He wasn't the weak, insecure man she had painted him to be. He had been a fool for trusting her, yes, but that didn't mean he would let her define his future. With every step, his resolve grew stronger. This wasn't just about his pride or his heartbreak anymore. It was about protecting the life he had built for himself and his children. Grace's games were over. In the days that followed, Daniel worked in silence, his determination unwavering. Every moment Grace wasn't watching, he poured his energy into gathering the evidence Claire had advised him to compile. Each piece he uncovered felt like another step toward reclaiming control over his life, even as it deepened the ache of betrayal. Late one night, while Grace was out running an errand, Daniel accessed the backup account tied to their shared cloud storage. His fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled through a cache of messages, hoping, yet dreading to find what he needed. His breath caught when he stumbled upon a string of texts between Grace and Eric, their mocking tone almost unbearable to read. "Eric, he'll never find out. He's too trusting, too soft." Grace, "Even if he did, it's not like he has the guts to do anything. He'd probably just cry about it." Daniel stared at the words, his chest tightening. The callousness, the casual disregard for his feelings, cut deeper than any confrontation could have. But instead of letting the anger consume him, he saved the messages, forwarding them to a secure folder Claire had recommended he keep. Each day, he uncovered more. Bank records revealed dinners and gifts that had been brushed off as business expenses. A quick scan of their home security system offered undeniable proof. Eric arriving late at night when Daniel was out of town, staying for hours. Every piece of evidence strengthened his case, even as it chipped away at the image he'd held of the life he thought he had. Grace, meanwhile, began to notice the change in him. His silence was unnerving, his calm composure even more so. She had expected tears, pleas, perhaps even anger, but not this. It unsettled her, and she began to poke and prod, searching for cracks in his armor. One evening, as Daniel sat at the dining table reviewing financial statements, Grace leaned casually against the doorway, her arms crossed. Her voice carried a forced lightness, but her words were sharp. "Whatever you're planning, it won't work," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You don't have the guts." Daniel didn't look up. He finished marking a line on the page before folding the papers neatly and setting them aside. Finally, he met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Grace," he said simply, his tone calm and measured. Her smirk faltered, and for the first time he saw something flicker in her eyes, unease. She tried to recover, letting out a dismissive scoff as she turned and walked away. But Daniel could feel the shift. The power dynamic between them was changing, and she could sense it. Daniel returned to his work, his focus unshaken. He spent hours piecing together the narrative, each document, message, and recording forming a puzzle that told the full story of Grace's betrayal. He made sure to secure everything, backing up files, organizing folders, and keeping meticulous notes. This wasn't just about winning a court case. It was about ensuring she couldn't manipulate the situation to hurt him, or, worse, their children. Despite the emotional toll, Daniel found a sense of purpose in the work. It gave him clarity, a way to channel his pain into something productive. For too long, he had let Grace's manipulation dictate his actions. But now, the control was shifting. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was planning, strategizing, preparing for the fight ahead. Each evening he went to bed knowing he was one step closer to freedom, one step closer to rebuilding the life she had tried to tear apart. And every time Grace pushed him with her taunts, he met her with quiet resolve, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. She might have underestimated him before, but that time was over. Daniel wasn't the man she thought he was, and soon she would see exactly what he was capable of. The living room was uncharacteristically silent, tension hanging heavy in the air. Family and friends sat uneasily, exchanging confused glances as they waited for Daniel to speak. Grace sat stiffly on the couch, her confident exterior now cracking under the weight of the unknown. Eric lingered near the back, shifting uncomfortably, while Daniel's mother avoided his gaze altogether. Daniel stood near the TV, calm and composed, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. He held the small remote in his hand, his knuckles white as he gripped it. Taking a deep breath, he looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze before he spoke. "You all deserve to see the truth," he began, his voice steady but laced with an edge. "For too long I've been blind to what's been happening right under my nose. But not anymore." With that, he pressed a button, and the screen lit up. The first video played, a clip from their home security footage. The room was silent as Grace and Eric appeared on screen, their intimate gestures undeniable. Gasps filled the air, and someone muttered under their breath, but Daniel's gaze remained fixed on Grace. Her face paled, her confidence unraveling with every passing second. "Daniel," she began, her voice trembling, "this isn't what it looks like. I wasn't thinking straight. It was a mistake." Daniel's composure cracked, anger flashing in his eyes. "A mistake?" he snapped, his voice rising. "How long has this been going on? Months? Years?" Grace opened her mouth, but no words came. She glanced around the room, searching for support, but the judgmental stares of their family offered no solace. "We were just, she stammered, but Daniel didn't let her finish. "Save it," he said coldly. "I have the receipts, the text messages, and the footage to prove it. You didn't just betray me. You mocked me. You made me out to be a fool in front of everyone, and you dragged my mother into it too." Grace's desperation grew, her voice rising. "Think of the kids, Daniel. We can go to counseling. We can fix this." Daniel's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Fix this?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Don't insult me. You threatened to take the kids from me, to use them as leverage. You don't care about fixing anything. You care about control. Well, that ends today. You're done." "We ask..." Grace slumped back on the couch, tears streaming down her face, but Daniel didn't flinch. He turned his attention to Eric, who had been silent until now, his face red with embarrassment. "And you," Daniel said, his voice low and icy, "my so-called best friend. How long were you laughing behind my back, Eric? How long were you pretending to care about me while sneaking around with my wife?" Eric stammered, his hands raised defensively. "It wasn't like that, man. I didn't mean for it to happen." "Don't," Daniel interrupted, his tone final. "You're not even worth my anger." The final blow came as Daniel turned to his mother, who sat at the edge of her seat, her hands trembling. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "And you," he said quietly, but the weight of his words hit harder than his anger. "You knew the whole time, didn't you? You chose her lies over your own son. You didn't." It was a deep silence, coupled by a low murmur of emotion. His mother's face crumpled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "I thought I was protecting you, Daniel," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to see your family fall apart." Daniel's eyes hardened, his voice devoid of warmth. "It fell apart the moment you chose to protect them instead of me." The room was silent again, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Grace sobbed quietly. Eric hung his head, and his mother's shoulders shook with regret. Daniel turned off the TV and stepped back, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. "This is the truth," he said finally, addressing everyone. "You've all seen it now. No more lies, no more manipulation. Grace, Eric, Mom, whatever you thought you could get away with, it's over." With that, Daniel walked toward the door, his steps steady and purposeful. He didn't need their apologies, their excuses, or their explanations. He had said everything he needed to, and for the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. The weight of their betrayal was still heavy, but the power they held over him was gone. He was free. The courtroom was sterile and unyielding, its quiet intensity broken only by the murmur of shuffled papers and the occasional whisper between attorneys. Daniel sat at his table, his posture straight, his face a mask of calm resolve. Across the room, Grace sat beside her lawyer, her confidence from weeks prior now replaced with a veneer of nervous composure. The weight of her actions and the mountain of evidence against her had left little room for rebuttal. The proceedings moved swiftly. Daniel's attorney, Claire, presented the evidence with meticulous precision: the security footage, financial records, and text messages that left no doubt about Grace's infidelity. The judge's questions were direct, and Grace's attempts to downplay her actions fell flat. Her lawyer's arguments for shared custody and alimony crumbled under the weight of Claire's firm rebuttals. By the end of the case, the ruling was decisive. Daniel was granted full custody of the children, with Grace permitted only limited supervised visitation. Her request for alimony was denied, the evidence of her betrayal making it impossible to justify any financial support. The gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, but for Daniel, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. As the courtroom emptied, Grace approached him in the hallway. Her eyes were red, her demeanor unusually subdued. She hesitated before speaking, her voice shaking with a mix of desperation and regret. "Please, Daniel," she began softly. "Let's not drag this out any further. We can find a way to work through this." Daniel met her gaze, his expression unmoved. He took a deep breath before responding, his words deliberate. "You dragged it out," he said, his tone firm but devoid of anger. "When you chose Eric over me and the kids. You made your choices, Grace. Now you'll have to live with them." Her face crumpled, but Daniel didn't linger. He had no interest in prolonging the conversation. For too long, her words had held power over him, but now they were just hollow echoes of a life he was leaving behind. Meanwhile, Eric's fall from grace was swift and brutal. His wife, Michelle, had wasted no time filing for divorce after discovering his infidelity. Unlike Daniel, Michelle had uncovered not only Eric's betrayal with Grace, but also a series of other indiscretions. Fueled by anger and a determination to hold him accountable, she exposed his misconduct at work, revealing falsified expense reports and inappropriate behavior with colleagues. The fallout was catastrophic. Eric lost his job, his reputation in ruins, and his financial stability crumbled beneath him. The ripple effects of Grace and Eric's actions became a cautionary tale among their social circles. The life they had built on deception was now in shambles, leaving them to grapple with the consequences of their choices. Grace's attempts to salvage her relationships with friends and family were met with cold indifference, while Eric's former colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his tarnished name. For Daniel, the aftermath was bittersweet. Winning custody of his children was a relief, a validation of his efforts to protect them. He threw himself into creating a stable, loving home for them, focusing on their happiness and well-being. Yet, There was an undeniable grief that lingered, the loss of the family he had once believed in, the betrayal by people he had trusted implicitly. But even in that grief, there was hope. Each day brought small victories. His children began to smile more, their laughter filling the house in a way it hadn't in months. The weight of uncertainty lifted as they adjusted to their new normal, finding comfort in Daniel's unwavering presence. Slowly, the pieces of their lives began to fit together again. For Grace and Eric, the path forward was far less certain. The choices they had made had cost them everything: relationships, reputations, and the stability they had taken for granted. Daniel didn't dwell on their misfortune. His focus was on the life he was rebuilding, one filled with purpose, integrity, and the unwavering love of his children. The scars of betrayal remained, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they were a testament to his resilience and the strength he had found in starting over. The months that followed were a period of quiet rebuilding for Daniel and his children. The wounds of the past lingered, but their home gradually became a place of warmth and laughter again. Daniel threw himself wholeheartedly into being present for his kids, ensuring they felt secure and loved. He attended every school event, coached their weekend soccer games, and carved out time for family movie nights, relishing in the small joys that had once been overshadowed by his crumbling marriage. The shift in their household was palpable. The children began to thrive, their smiles growing wider and their laughter more frequent. Though questions about Grace occasionally surfaced, Daniel answered them with honesty and compassion, always emphasizing that their happiness and stability were his priority. He wasn't just healing himself, he was helping his children do the same. One day, while picking up his youngest from an after-school art program, Daniel met Amelia. She was the kind of person who radiated kindness, her warm smile immediately putting others at ease. She was the program's art teacher, her passion for creativity evident in the way she spoke to the children. Amelia introduced herself with an easy confidence, and their first conversation was light and engaging. Over time, their paths crossed more frequently, with casual greetings turning into meaningful chats. It wasn't long before Daniel found himself looking forward to their interactions. Amelia's presence was a refreshing contrast to the chaos he had endured. She was grounded, compassionate, and genuine. Their relationship developed slowly, naturally, as if neither wanted to rush what felt so significant. Daniel admired Amelia's ability to connect with his children, her patience and warmth making her an easy addition to their family dynamic. She introduced them to new creative projects, painting afternoons in the backyard and crafting sessions on rainy weekends. The kids adored her, and her presence brought a sense of balance to their lives. Amelia, in turn, respected the space Daniel needed to navigate his emotions. She listened without judgment and encouraged his growth, reminding him of his worth with quiet but powerful support. Their bond deepened, not out of necessity or loneliness, but because they complemented each other in ways Daniel hadn't thought possible. One evening, after a family dinner that Amelia had helped prepare, Daniel found himself watching her interact with his kids. The sight of her laughing with them, seamlessly fitting into the rhythm of their lives, filled him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since his world had fallen apart, Daniel felt something new: hope. Amelia wasn't just a source of love and support. She was a reminder that life could be rebuilt, and happiness could flourish again. Together, they began to create a future that was rooted in trust, love, and the lessons learned from the past. In the quiet weeks that followed the court ruling, Daniel found himself visited by ghosts from his recent past. Grace was the first to reach out, her attempts at reconciliation laced with desperation. She showed up unannounced at his doorstep one evening, her once sharp confidence replaced by a hollow fragility. The children were upstairs, oblivious to the conversation unfolding downstairs. "I just need your forgiveness," Grace said, her voice trembling as she stood in the doorway. "Please, Daniel, I've lost everything. I'm trying to make things right." Daniel leaned against the door frame, his expression calm but resolute. He studied her for a moment, as if weighing her words. Finally, he spoke, his tone measured and firm. "Forgiveness isn't something you demand, Grace," he said, meeting her gaze. "It's something you earn. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever be able to give it to you." Grace's face crumpled, but Daniel didn't waver. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," he continued, his voice steady. "I just need you to understand that some things can't be undone. I've moved on, and I think you should too." Her shoulders slumped and she nodded reluctantly, the finality in his tone leaving no room for argument. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her figure retreating into the darkness as Daniel closed the door. He stood there for a moment, exhaling deeply, the encounter stirring emotions he thought he had put to rest. But as he turned and heard the laughter of his children upstairs, he felt grounded again. Grace no longer had power over him, and that was a victory he refused to relinquish. A week later, it was his mother who reached out, seeking her own absolution. She invited him to coffee, her message tentative and apologetic. Daniel agreed, more out of curiosity than a desire to reconcile. They met at a quiet cafe, the tension between them palpable. "I don't know where to start," she began, her hands clasping her coffee cup tightly. "I made a terrible mistake, Daniel. I thought I was protecting you by staying quiet, by trying to hold everything together. But I see now that I only made things worse." Her voice cracked, and tears welled in her eyes. "I can't undo what I did, but I hope one day you'll find it in your heart to forgive me." Daniel looked at her, his emotions conflicting. He had loved and trusted his mother his entire life, but her complicity in Grace's betrayal had left a wound that wasn't easily healed. He sighed, his tone soft but firm. "I appreciate your honesty," he said, "but forgiveness isn't something I can give right now. I need time, Mom. I need to figure out what our relationship looks like moving forward." She nodded, her tears falling freely now. "I understand," she whispered. "I just hope we can find our way back to each other someday." The conversation ended on a note of cautious hope, but as Daniel drove home, he felt a sense of closure settling over him. The people who had hurt him most had sought his forgiveness, but he realized that forgiveness was as much about himself as it was about them. He didn't have to rush the process, nor did he owe them absolution on their terms. Healing was his journey, and he would take it at his own pace. Back home, Amelia greeted him with a warm smile, her steady presence grounding him once more. As he joined his children at the dinner table, he was reminded that his focus was no longer on the people who had broken his trust, but on those who had earned it. The scars would remain, but they no longer defined him. Daniel had found his peace, and that was enough. It was because of that he went through his work days, feeling fully present in his work and appreciating the path. The spring morning was warm and bright, the kind of day that felt like a promise of new beginnings. Daniel stood at the altar in a small, sunlit garden, surrounded by his children, close friends, and family. Amelia walked toward him, radiant in her simple white dress, her smile full of the quiet assurance that had drawn him to her in the first place. The air hummed with joy and hope, a stark contrast to the darkness he had once lived through. As their vows unfolded, Daniel's heart swelled with a gratitude he could hardly put into words. Amelia wasn't just a partner. She was the embodiment of everything he had thought he lost. Her unwavering kindness, her patience with his children, and her belief in his strength had given him the courage to trust again. When he slid the ring onto her finger, he felt not just love, but a sense of renewal, as if this was where he had always been meant to end up. Later that evening, as the festivities wound down, Daniel and Amelia sat together on a quiet bench beneath a canopy of string lights. His children played in the distance, their laughter carrying on the soft breeze. Daniel turned to her, his voice thick with emotion. "I wouldn't have made it without you," he said, his hand clasping hers. Amelia smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "You just needed someone to remind you of who you are," she replied gently. "The rest was always in you." Her words settled in his chest, and for a moment, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The betrayal that had once consumed him now felt like a distant memory, its edges dulled by time and perspective. He realized that Grace and Eric's actions, though devastating, had been the catalyst for his transformation. Without their betrayal, he might never have found the strength to rebuild himself, or the clarity to recognize the kind of love he truly deserved. As he watched Amelia and the children, a thought struck him, one that he had never fully grasped until now. The best revenge wasn't watching Grace and Eric struggle with the consequences of their choices. It wasn't about bitterness or wishing them harm. The best revenge was living a life so full of love, joy, and purpose that their betrayal became irrelevant. It was choosing to rise above the pain and create something beautiful in its place. In that moment, Daniel felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known was possible. His life wasn't perfect, but it was his. A life shaped by resilience, filled with people who mattered, and guided by a love that was genuine and enduring. As the night deepened and the stars began to dot the sky, Daniel leaned back and gazed upward, a quiet smile playing on his lips. The past no longer held power over him, and the future stretched out before him like an open canvas. What had once been a story of heartbreak and betrayal had transformed into one of strength and renewal. It was a lesson that lingered, a truth he carried forward. Sometimes, the greatest pain leads to the greatest growth. And with that, Daniel chose to leave the past behind, stepping fully into the life he had built. A life worth remembering, not for the scars, but for the beauty that had blossomed from them. The lightness of day by day had worn away the tragedy of his life that had been the worst part of it.